Okay, so we have 3 topics to cover as part of this. We need to learn how to do menus. We need to learn a little bit about navigation. We need to learn how to make the up or the home button do the right thing. I told you a couple of lectures ago that I was going to do that. And then about dialogues. And dialogues, you don't actually need any dialogues for your Family Map client unless you're doing some of the extra credit or the optional extra credit parts of the assignment. But you should, as an Android programmer, you should still know how to do menus. So that's why I'm going to talk about, or I'm sorry, you should know how to do dialogues. So that's why I'm going to talk about them. Let's start with menus. So first of all, to add a menu to an activity, there are a few things you should do. You should start by putting the menu, the strings that go in the menu in your strings file. We don't want to hard code any strings. We want to make our applications really easy to internationalize and then localize to any particular language. And so we're going to put the menus in the strings file. Then you need to add a new layout file. So there's a new kind of layout file called a menu layout file. So when you create that from Android, just like you're used to going and creating a layout resource, you'll still create a layout resource, but you'll select menu as the resource type, and then you will add attributes to it. I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. And then there are 2 methods you need to override. You need to override the onCreateOptions menu method, and from there you inflate the menu layout. And then in order to respond to click events, the way you do that is you override the onOptionsItemSelected method. That's a callback that gets called whenever a menu item is clicked. And so that allows you to write code in response to a menu item. So let's go look at an example that has a menu item on it. So here's my activity menu example, and let's run it first. Okay, so this is the menu. So in my menu, I've got these 2 little icons. I started with the Hello World example that you get by default when you create an example, and I just added the code that I needed to get a menu on it. Notice though that the menu changes a little bit if I rotate where I have more room. So if I have enough room, it displays a name in addition to an icon. And if I don't, then it just displays the icon. So that's the first thing to know, and that's back in our slides. So we have some flags that you can specify for a menu item. Actually, it probably makes more sense to show you the flags after I show you where it is in the code. So I've got so many things open that it's having a hard time finding it. There we go. Okay, so this is we'll start with the layout file. So this is my menu layout, and the way I created it is I went to File, New, and maybe I can't see that unless I'm in the RES directory. So we'll click in there. Now we'll do File, New, Android resource file. And that's where you specify menu as the type. Okay, so I'm not going to do that because I already did it. When you do that, it puts your layout file right here under menu, and this is our layout file. So the layout file has the, you declare items, and those are your menu items. So again, we're going to give them an ID because we need to get to them in our other code. We specify the title, and we're going to pull that out of our strings file. You can also specify an icon, and so I have declared a drawable, which is like an image in Android. There's a lot that could be said about that. I'm just going to refer you to your book. I have a slide that tells you what pages in the book tell you how to create icons. So you can look there to learn how to do that. And then here is where you can specify some flags that determine how it gets displayed. So that's how I that's how I made it so I see the icons if there isn't much room, and if there's more room, I see the icons with their text. Okay, so I've specified these two flags, if room with text. All right, so that's all there is to the menu file, or the menu layout file. So let's see what we need to do in code. So first of all, let's look at the onCreate options menu. This, I at least need to do this for every menu. I need to get the menu inflator and then inflate it. And I'm just inflating the menu that I passed, and I'm specifying the layout, the menu layout ID. So that is r.menu.main menu. It's not actually an ID I declared. It's referring to this whole menu layout file. Okay, so you always need to do that. The reason I have other code here is I am programmatically adding one of the icons. So if you look right here, you can see that for the file menu, I added the icon in the layout.xml. For the person menu, I did not, because I wanted to use an icon that wasn't really available. I wanted to use an icon from the Font Awesome library, and so I did that programmatically. So that's what this is. This is grabbing an icon from the Font Awesome library. You may want to use that if you wanted to make your family map client look exactly like mine, or like the one in the spec. You would need to use these Font Awesome icons, but you're free to use other icons as well. Okay, so to do that though, we need to get a reference to the menu item. So we do that by calling menu.findItem and specify the ID for the item. So I declared person menu item as the ID, so I use that to get a reference to it. And then I call the set icon method. For using the Font Awesome library, you have to first initialize it. So that's what this method call is here for. Iconify with, and then you pass in a reference to a new Font Awesome module. And that makes it so the icons in this Font Awesome library are available. And so then inside of the call to set icon, I need to create a new icon drawable object. And inside of there, I am using this static reference to specify a Font Awesome icon. There are many, I think there are hundreds of Font Awesome icons. And so if you just do a Google search for Font Awesome, you can find out this static method name that goes with a particular icon. And so that's how I'm specifying that little picture of a user here. So it's that icon. Okay, you specify the color, and that's any color from your color resources file. And we're putting it in the action bar. This is the action bar right here. This is the action bar. So we want it to be appropriately sized for that. And so we just call .actionBarSize, and that will make it be the right size for that. Okay, that's basically it for onCreate options menu. The next thing we want to do is respond to clicking the menus. So if we look right here, if I click that, I just pop up a toast again. If I click that, I pop up a different toast. So the way we do that is in our on options item selected. We're going to be passed a menu, and we're just going to switch on the ID of the menu to determine which menu was clicked. And if it's file menu, I pop up this toast, and if it's person menu, I pop up a different toast. If it's anything else, I need to make sure I do this, because there are other menu items that there can be an up button. We're going to learn how to do that next. And I want that to work properly as well. So I always want to call super on option item selected and pass the menu item if I didn't create the menu item that is passed in. That's not necessarily an error if that happens. Okay, any questions about that? All right, so let's go learn a little bit more about menus. So I just have this slide in here with the flags. I use these two flags to get my menus to work the way I wanted them to, I used if room and with text. Those are probably the most common flags to use, but you have a couple of other flags as well. And if you want to learn more about them, here's a link to some details about them. Okay, this is some information about adding an icon, and I already showed you code for that. You can do it from a layout file, and you saw this in my layout file. I used the Android :icon and specified an icon that existed. The reason it existed is because I used the Android Asset Studio to make it exist. So follow these pages to learn how to create an icon and make it available to your layout files. And then you saw that you can also do it programmatically from onCreate options menu, and we just went through the code for how to create a font awesome icon from there. Okay, in order to use font awesome, you have to declare that as a dependency in your build.gradle. These are the dependencies you should need for that. The one thing to know about font awesome is it's actually pretty old. It hasn't been updated for a long time. I guess whoever was maintaining it went on to something else. And so all the icons are available, and there are a lot of them, so it's still useful, but it's kind of old. And so what that means is it's not getting updated, so there's no current version for it. And so there's a current version, but there's no recent version for it. And so I have had cases where if I try to specify the dependency in my build.gradle, I get a problem. The problem is it comes with transitive dependencies. If you have a dependency in your build.gradle that depends on something else, Gradle will pull the something else into your project automatically. That works great, and it's usually what you want it to do. The problem is if it pulls something else in that is a different version of that thing that already exists in your project, then you're going to have a problem, because Android is not okay with having two different versions of the same library. And so on some earlier versions of Android Studio, I was having this problem where if I tried to add the font awesome dependencies, it would pull in com.android.support, but it was a different version, an older version of the one that my project was using, and then I had a problem and my project wouldn't build. I don't think you have that anymore, because we're now using Android X.support, so when Iconify pulls in this library, it probably isn't going to clash with anything else. But if it does, all you have to do is tell Gradle not to pull in that transitive dependency, and you do that with this code down here. Okay, so sorry that was a long explanation to tell you something that you probably don't need, but if you do have that problem where your project won't build anymore once you add the font awesome library, and it seems to be some problem in your Gradle file, you probably need to do this. You probably need to change your dependency to be these two down here that exclude this library. Okay, so you can just ignore that unless you have the problem, and then I hope you remember that this slide is here. This shows you the code we already went through, so it's probably good to have it in a slide though to remind you that you have to do this Iconify with thing in the onCreate in order to make font awesome available. And then this is the code we already looked at to see how to programmatically create a font awesome icon instance. All right, that was how to add a menu to an activity. There's just a little bit more that you have to do to add a menu to a fragment. Because if you think about how fragments work, fragments get displayed on some activity, but it's the activity that has the menu. So if you want a fragment to be able to determine what menu gets displayed on its hosting activity, there's a little bit more you have to do. So you have to call setHasOptionsMenu inside of the onCreate for your fragment. So on your menu callbacks, you have to do that, or the menu will never display. And then the method signature is a little bit different in the onCreate options menu in a fragment. You receive a menu inflator as a parameter, and the reason for that is because when your fragment gets attached to an activity, you need the menu inflator that the activity is using. So it has to be passed into you. And so those are really the only two differences. As long as you do those two things that are different, you can display a menu on a fragment. And in your case, you do need to do that. You have a map fragment that, if you think about your main activity, when you're looking at your login, you don't have a menu. And when you go to your map fragment, you do. And so you're specifying the menu from the fragment. Okay, so let's go look at the criminal intent example for that. Okay, so we're not going to run this. We're not going to look at all the details. We're just going to look at what's unique about doing the menu on the fragment. So this is a fragment that displays a menu in that example. It calls set has options menu true. If you don't do that, then your menu is never going to be displayed, and you're going to wonder why it seems like all of your code is exactly right, but your menu is not appearing. You have to do that from your fragment in order to get a menu to display on its hosting activity. And then notice right here, the other difference in onCreate view, actually, that's not what I want to look at. In onCreate options menu, we're getting an inflator passed in. In the previous example where we put a menu on an activity, we didn't receive this parameter. So you just use that parameter to inflate the view instead of the get menu inflator method that we called in the other example. Everything else is the same. The on options item selected method is the same. You just do the exact same thing that we did in the previous example. Okay, one more thing to say about menus, and that is how to get the up button to work correctly. So let's go back here again. The up button is the button. Actually, maybe I should show you that in my family map example. I need to start my server to do that. Okay, so there's my server. Here's my family map project. And remember, when we click into some other activity, we have this button right here. This is called the up button. Sometimes it's called the home button. And we need that to work correctly. And so that's the next thing we're going to learn, is how to get that to work. Okay, so the way you do that is inside of your manifest file, you need to specify the activity you want to go to when that button is pressed. So for each activity, we haven't really looked at that very much. We haven't had too many reasons to, but every activity that you create in your project has an entry in that manifest file. And so all the ones that should have an up button on them need to declare Android:parent activity name, and you have to specify the name of the activity you want to go to. So let's go back to my project, and we will see where that's declared here. Okay, so in my family map inside of my manifest, here are the entries for all of these activities. You didn't have to create them all. They're all created when you create the activity, but they all specify their parent activity. The reason mine has .view in front of it is because all of my activities are in a view package. If you don't put yours in a view package, then you wouldn't have a package declared here. Okay, so that says what activity I want to go to when I press that button. And there's one more thing you need to know about this navigation, and then I'll end there and record the dialogue stuff separately. And that is, you need to go, remember when you go to the main activity, you don't want to get a new instance of the main activity. But the code you know how to write so far would create a new instance. So when you go from one activity to another, you create an intent to specify the activity you want to go to, and then you call a method, and that will take you to that activity. By default, that always creates a new activity, but that's not what we want. If you do that in your example, remember when you go back, in fact, I should just stay in my example and just show you that. When I go notice that I've got something clicked here. If I go to some other activity and then I go back, this is not a new instance of this fragment. It's the same instance I was looking at before. I need to have some way to control that and not have a new instance. The way I do that is when after I create the intent, before calling start activity, I set two flags. I set the flag activity single top and flag activity clear top. So let's talk about the second one first. What this does is it says, if you've got a stack of activities and one of them is the activity I just asked for, pop everything that's on top of it off until you get to that activity. So instead of sticking a new activity on top of the stack, go to the one that's already in the stack. That's what this one does. And then this flag says, if the activity I just asked for is already on the top, there should only be one. So don't stack another one on top of it. Use the one that's already on top. So that makes it so I never get a second main activity. I always just go to the same one. That will keep this working correctly for you. Okay, I think that's all I need to say about navigation. You need to do the same thing when you log out. When you log out and go back to your main activity, you need to set these two flags. That will pop everything off and you'll go to your main activity, and that will make it so when I push this button later, I don't cycle back through other activities on the stack because they will have been popped off. Okay, so that's definitely something that you are going to lose points on if you don't do that correctly. It's not hard to do correctly. Just make sure that you are setting those two flags when you go back to your main activity from any place that you go back. The last thing we need to talk about is Android Dialogs. You don't actually need to create any dialogues as part of your Family Map client unless you want to do, there's one of the extra credit parts of it that would require a dialogue. Other than that, you don't need them. But you can't really call yourself an Android programmer if you don't know how to do dialogues. So let's learn how to do that. What you need to do to create a dialogue is you create an instance of the alert dialog by calling a builder method. So you call the static method builder on alert dialog and you pass in a context, which is a reference to whatever fragment or activity this dialog is being displayed on. And then skipping down here, there are several methods that you can call on a dialog to build it the way you want. You can call the set title method and the set message method. That'll give it the title that you want at the top of the dialog, and the message gives it the body that you want. You can also call set view, and you could inflate a view and specify whatever view you want for your dialog, but normally we don't need that. For most of our dialogs, we're just wanting to display text, so you need just title and message for that. You can call set positive button, set negative button, and set neutral button, which will give you up to 3 buttons on your dialog. And there are many other methods that you can call, but these are the most common ones that you would need. I have an example of a simple dialog that we'll look at, but before that, I need to talk about one other thing. This is not required, but highly recommended that you wrap your dialog in a dialog fragment. If you just create an alert dialog, you can pop a dialog up, but then if your phone rotates, so if you're looking at it in portrait and then you rotate to landscape, the dialog would disappear. Nobody would expect that. If they're looking at a dialog, they wouldn't expect it to disappear if they rotate. And so you can only prevent that by putting it in a dialog fragment. So we'll go look at the example that shows how to use these methods and also puts the dialog in a dialog fragment. Okay, so we will start by running the example so you can see what it looks like. So this is a simple example that just has one button on it, a simple activity that has one button, the open dialog button, and I push that, and there's my dialog. So this is the title, this is the body, and I've got a positive and a negative button on it. What I was saying about rotating, if I rotate the phone, the dialog would have disappeared when I did that if I hadn't put it inside of a dialog fragment. Okay, and then I also have some code behind each of these buttons. I have event listeners, so if I press OK, I see that toast, and if I press cancel, I see a different toast. So that's really all there is to this example. So let's see how we made it. Okay, so here's our activity. The layout for it is simple. It just has one button on it. If we look at the code here in the onCreate method, first we are getting a reference to the button, and we're setting an onClick listener on that button. And then because I have created the dialog, I could just put the code for alert.builder inside this onClick method. That would be really easy to do, but then I'd have that rotation problem. So instead of doing that, I have a static inner class where I have declared my dialog. So let's look at that first. So the class name is my dialog fragment, and it just has an onCreate dialog method. So I'm overriding that from the parent class that I'm extending. And in there, I return a new instance of alert dialog, which is created by calling the builder method, as I showed in the slides. So I pass a reference to the activity that's displaying it, or if it was going to display on a fragment, I'd pass a reference to the fragment. Here I'm using the title and message methods, the set title and set message methods. Notice that the strings are internationalized. I'm pulling them from the string values file. And then I'm setting a positive and a negative button. And both of those methods, set positive button and set negative button, take two parameters. The first parameter is a reference to the name or the label that goes on the button. And then the second one is an onClick listener. And so that's pretty simple. My onClick listener just has one method, onClick, and in there I am just displaying a toast to indicate that the person pressed the positive button. And again, I'm pulling that message out of the strings file. Same thing for the negative button click. I'm just pulling that message out of the strings file and setting it as the And the same thing for the negative button. I'm just pulling that string out of the strings file. Then the last thing I need to do after I have called all the methods to set the alert dialog up the way I want it, I just call create, and that will create an instance of alert dialog. And this method just returns that instance. So that takes us up to here where we have our dialog that we've created. Now, because it's a fragment, I need to display it with a fragment manager. So this gets a reference to the support fragment manager. That's the same support fragment manager we used in the fragments lecture to display our fragments. And we have our dialog, so we call dialog.show, and that show method takes two parameters. It takes a dialog or a fragment manager that can manage displaying the fragment, and it takes a tag. So really, whenever you're working with a fragment, you use a manager, and the manager will know about the fragment once you call a method that lets the manager know the fragment exists. We may want to access that fragment later. Usually with a dialog, there's no reason to access it later, but if we wanted to, we could. And so the second parameter is a tag that we can use to pull the dialog or access that fragment from the fragment manager later. So that's why there's a second parameter there. So that's all there is to creating a simple dialog. There are more sophisticated dialogs that you can create. Because you can specify the view for a dialog, you can do a lot more with them. And so I'll show you another example. This one is from the criminal intent example, the version that, if you're following along with the chapters, the version you would have created in chapter 13. So if we run that, in this example, if I create a new crime, then I can specify the date and time of the crime from a dialog. So this is a dialog that has a calendar on it, and I can specify the date. So that's just one example of a more sophisticated thing that you can do with a dialog. And if you want to see the details of that, you can look at that in the criminal intent example.